Now, gather round, folks. Fill up a chair, get comfortable, because I'm about to ask you to forget what you think you know about American history. You know the big stories, right? You know the tale of the Mayflower hitting Plymouth Rock, that's the clean, brave beginning. You know about the powdered wigs and the Declaration of Independence, that's the soaring, glorious part. You know about the March West, the covered wagons, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, that's the epic, conquering adventure. All true, all vital, but beneath those grand narratives, tucked away in the musty attics of our national memory, covered in the deep, uncomfortable dust of hypocrisy, is a story so bizarre, so astonishing, and frankly, so shocking that it sounds like the premise for a thriller novel. I'm talking about a time when America didn't just expand westward. Oh no. I'm talking about a time, right in the thick of our young republic's most fraught and morally contradictory years, when a powerful, unbelievably connected cabal of the nation's elite, slave owners, presidents, Supreme Court justices, and the very men who wrote our national anthem, conspired to create a brand new country, an entire nation, on a distant, dangerous coast in Africa. Doesn't that sound impossible? A parallel universe where the solution to America's deepest sin was literally to export the people who were the victims of it and create a mirror republic thousands of miles away? It's not fiction. It's absolutely true. And it is, without a doubt, one of the most astonishing, well-documented, and secretly bizarre chapters in the history of the United States. It's the story of a place called Liberia, and the unlikely, often horrifying journey of the thousands of American citizens, free black men and women, and emancipated slaves who were sent there not by a government mandate, but by a powerful private society with deep governmental ties. This is the kind of history that sounds boring when a professor mumbles about the repatriation movement. But when you look at the human cost, the sheer madness of the logistics, and the dizzying array of moral contradictions at its heart, it becomes a story of ghost fleets, impossible ideals, and a republic born of paradox. So settle in. Let me tell you about the wildest American experiment you've never fully heard. The setup, the irony that choked the nation. To understand the sheer audacity of this plan, you have to understand the toxic air we breathed in the decades after the Revolution, say between 1800 and 1830. We had just declared that all men are created equal, a truly soaring, breathtaking ideal, the greatest ever committed to paper. But look around, and what did you see? You saw the new nation choking on an irony so vast it threatened to tear the country apart from day one. 1 in every 5 Americans, and in the South, closer to 1 in 3, was enslaved. The wealth, the stability, the entire agricultural engine of the new nation was built on the backs of human bondage. The men who ran the country, the ones wrestling with this original sin, didn't have a good answer. They knew deep down that it was a moral catastrophe, but they were also politically and economically trapped. 3 groups emerged from the moral wreckage. The abolitionists, the radicals, they were the purest voice. They said, emancipate them all, and not just free them, but treat them as full, equal citizens, a direct, immediate, and complete solution. The slave owners, the entrenched, they were the brutal realists. They said, no, our economy depends on them, and anyway, they are not fit for society. We need them, and we fear them. The colonizationists, this is the group we need to focus on. They were the people who genuinely hated slavery, but were terrified of the consequences of mass emancipation. Now let that sink in. They were abolitionists with a massive asterisk. They looked at the hundreds of thousands of free black people already living in the North and South, people who were lawyers, sailors, tradesmen, and entrepreneurs, and they worried. Why? because the very sight of a free, prosperous black American was a living, breathing challenge to the entire system of slavery. They saw segregated cities. They saw racial violence, like the riots in Philadelphia, for instance. They saw economic competition breeding hatred among poor white laborers. And they came to a cynical, shocking conclusion that became their driving force.
A truly integrated, equal society is impossible in America. It was a terrible, cowardly admission of defeat, a surrender to racism and fear. But these powerful men, often driven by the best of misguided intentions, believed that black Americans would never be safe, never be truly free, and never be truly equal on American soil. Their solution? To create a safe haven for them, to export the problem, to build a new black-led America thousands of miles away, where the American flag could fly without the shadow of the auction block. The conspirators, a who's who of American power. The year is 1816. The place is Washington, D.C. Now I want you to imagine the scene, not the well-lit marble of the modern Capitol, but a dark, claustrophobic, mahogany-paneled room, perhaps in a tavern or a private club. The fire is crackling, the air is thick with cigar smoke and the scent of fear, ambition, and compromise. Who is sitting around that table? It's not some fringe group of radicals or starry-eyed idealists. Oh no. At that table is a roster of American power that would shock any modern history student. Henry Clay, the powerful Speaker of the House, the great compromiser, a slave owner from Kentucky. He's the chairman of this clandestine gathering. He wanted free black people gone because they were a threat to the stability of the slave system. Bushrod Washington, the nephew of George Washington, a Supreme Court justice and a massive Virginia slave owner. When he died, he freed some of his own slaves only on the condition they would go to Liberia. Francis Scott Key, yes, that Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote the words to the Star-Spangled Banner, a prosecutor and Washington elite, was a fervent colonizationist. And others, senators, congressmen, future presidents like James Monroe and Andrew Jackson, and powerful religious leaders like Elias Caldwell. In the candlelight of that mahogany room, they formed the American Society for Colonizing the Free People of Color of the United States, the ACS. Their goal was simple, yet gargantuan: to raise money, buy land in West Africa, and transport every free black person and every emancipated slave who wished to go, and, in the minds of some, who could be convinced or coerced to go, to this new land. Here is the first major shocker for any American audience. This wasn't some independent charity. It was supported by the federal government. In 1819, Congress appropriated $100,000, a truly massive sum at the time, to help settle the first group of immigrants, framing it as a project to halt the slave trade. The ACS, a private organization run by slaveholders and ambitious politicians, was essentially carrying out a quasi-governmental foreign policy. And the irony, the sheer suffocating irony, the very people who wanted to get rid of black Americans out of racial fear, and the very people who genuinely wanted to see them achieve true liberty away from American racism, came together in this single, impossible, poisoned project. The slave owners wanted to remove the unsettling sight of free black people who might encourage their own slaves to revolt. The anti-slavery idealists genuinely believed this was the only path to true liberty and dignity away from American racism. A perfect, tragic confluence of self-interest, idealism, and the darkest brand of American fear. The stage was set for the greatest and perhaps most tragic exodus in American history. The Ghost Fleet begins, the maiden voyage of the Elizabeth. The money was raised, the political maneuvering was complete. Now for the first ship. In January of 1820, a hired brigantine, a two-masted square-rigged ship called the Elizabeth, was tied up at a pier in New York Harbor. The decks were slick with winter frost, and a chill, cutting wind swept across the deck. Aboard were 88 emigrants, free black men, women, and children from cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Richmond. They were led by 3 white agents from the ACS, including a doctor and 2 clergy members. Imagine the courage. Imagine the crushing weight of hope and fear. These 88 souls were the founding fathers and mothers of a new nation. They were pioneers, full of courage and a desperate desire to escape the suffocating bigotry of America. They packed their meager belongings, their tools, their Bibles, and their dreams, believing they were going to a land of promise, a land of true self-determination. They were leaving the country they had built because the country they had built refused to grant them freedom. The journey itself was a brutal 3-month slog across the Atlantic. It was a reverse flow, from America to Africa, an experience not entirely dissimilar in its raw human misery to the original Middle Passage. But the truly shocking part of this beginning is what happened when they arrived. The initial plan was to land near Sierra Leone, where the British had already established a colony for freed slaves. But the American agents, utterly clueless about the African climate and coastal politics, were hopelessly unprepared. They arrived right at the beginning of the rainy season, the worst possible time of year. They quickly realized the land they were supposed to buy wasn't available. They found themselves forced to wait on swampy, mosquito-infested ground. And then disaster struck. It was swift, aggressive, and overwhelming.
Disease. Malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever, the so-called African fever, were rampant. The sickness was so aggressive, so deadly, that it wiped out 3/4 of the original white agents, the people with the maps, the money, and the authority, and nearly 1/5 of the black emigrants within the first 4 months. The dream was drowning in swampy ground and fever. The first attempt at an American-sponsored African Republic was an utter, horrific failure. The survivors, terrified and near death, had to be rescued and housed by the established British colonists in Sierra Leone. This initial disaster, a true human catastrophe, would have sunk a lesser project. But the proponents back in Washington were too invested, both financially and philosophically. They could not admit defeat. They had an original sin to assuage and a problem to export. They had to try again. The audacity of theft. King Peter and the gunpoint deal. The ACS knew they needed a new, permanent foothold, a place that could be defended, a place that wouldn't immediately kill the new arrivals. In late 1821, a new, more determined, and frankly more ruthless white ACS agent named Eli Ayres, along with an American naval officer named Lieutenant Robert Stockton, sailed down the coast looking for land. Stockton was a fiery, aggressive man, full of the imperial, swaggering spirit of American expansionism that would later fuel Manifest Destiny. He and Ayres finally spotted a desirable piece of land, Cape Miserado, a dramatic, high promontory that offered good harbor, fresh water, and a highly defensible position. The only problem? It was controlled by a powerful local ruler known as King Peter, a title, not his name, and several other tribal chiefs who'd lived there for centuries. Stockton and Ayres met with the chiefs in a tense, chaotic negotiation. The chiefs had no desire to sell their ancestral, sacred land to these foreigners. Ayres offered them some muskets, some tobacco, some clothes, and other trinkets. King Peter refused. This is where the story becomes truly shocking, a dark mirror of the worst parts of American history on its own soil. Lieutenant Stockton, a U.S. Navy officer acting completely outside the bounds of U.S. law but with the full aggressive spirit of American empire, stood up, pulled out his pistol, and held it directly to King Peter's head. Under threat of immediate death, King Peter and the other chiefs were forced to sign a treaty. They were compelled to sell. The price for the land, a chunk of sovereign West African territory about 36 miles long, was a pitiful collection of trade goods which officially included 6 muskets, 1 barrel of gunpowder, 6 iron pots, 12 hats, 12 pairs of shoes, 20 looking glasses, and 1 barrel of rum. For this meager bounty, a treaty was signed. A whole new country was purchased. It was a transaction steeped in intimidation and pure colonial theft, mirroring the brutal playbook of European powers, and it was carried out by Americans in the name of freedom for Black Americans. The year is 1822. The land is secured. They named the settlement Christopolis, City of Christ, but a year later, the ACS decided to give it a grander, more symbolic name, Monrovia, after the U.S. President and colonization supporter, James Monroe. The country itself would eventually be called Liberia, the land of the free. A nation born in an American conspiracy, on land stolen with an American gun, the paradox was only just beginning.
The constant siege, pioneers of the gun. Now, shift your focus from the scheming white men in Washington and the aggressive naval officers to the true heroes of this story, the settlers. The Black American men, women, and children who had crossed the ocean to plant the flag of freedom. Imagine their arrival after the land was stolen. They stepped off the boats onto Cape Mesurado. The soil was rich, the air was thick with humidity, and the jungle pressed close like a looming green wall. But there was no infrastructure, no welcoming committee, and certainly no easy life. They were immediately subjected to 2 terrible forces: the African fever. First, the relentless, murderous disease. The African fever, malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, continued its devastating work. Survival rates for the early settlers were horrifyingly low. It wasn't uncommon for an estimated 1 in 3 of all emigrants who arrived in the first few decades to die within their first year. It was a true crucible of death, a baptism by fire and fever that purged the weak and tested the faith of the strong. Imagine burying your child or your spouse on an unknown shore, thousands of miles from the familiar soil of America, all for a dream of liberty. War. Victims become oppressors. Second, the war. The local indigenous tribes, enraged by Stockton's deception and the blatant theft of their ancestral land, did not recognize the treaty. They saw the Americo-Liberians, the Americans as they called them, as invaders. The indigenous people were determined to drive the Americans back into the sea before the new settlement could take root. The Americo-Liberians found themselves in a state of constant, desperate siege. The early settlement was a fortified camp, not a town. In November 1822, the conflict reached its climax. The indigenous forces launched a massive, coordinated attack. The colony was defended by only a handful of settlers, led by an extraordinary, self-taught Black American leader named Elijah Johnson. Johnson, whose courage would become legendary, commanded a tiny force against hundreds of warriors armed mainly with spears and bows. The settlers fought with incredible courage and ingenuity, relying on a few small cannons and a strategic defense to hold off the attackers. They were fighting for the dream they had crossed the ocean for, but they were doing it by conquering the rightful owners of the land. This is the central, stunning paradox of Liberia.
It was a colony founded by victims of American oppression who then became the oppressors of the native African people. They were simultaneously fleeing a colonial system and establishing a new one. A republic born in the shadow of American slavery was immediately forced to rely on violence and exclusion to survive. Despite the overwhelming odds, the colony held. More ships arrived. Year after year, the ghost fleet kept coming, carrying another few hundred souls, some fleeing oppression, some sold to the ACS by their former masters, and many simply seeking a better life, any life, outside the suffocating confines of racist America. The story now shifts to the bizarre political and cultural landscape of the new settlement. A society that was a weird, distorted mirror of the America they had left behind. The culture of paradox. The Americo-Liberians began to build a society that was less a new culture and more a meticulously preserved time capsule of 19th century American manners and aspirations. The dress. They dressed in the formal, stuffy clothes of 19th century America, top hats, morning coats, and hoop skirts, utterly impractical for the tropical heat. This was their way of projecting civilization and distinction against the indigenous people and European colonists. They were literally trying to recreate a piece of the South, the look of the planter class on the African coast. They were recreating the master's house, not just fleeing it. The new aristocracy. And the laws? They created a rigid U.S.-style government with a president, a Senate, and a House of Representatives. But this government was only for the Americo-Liberians. The vast majority of the people living within the colony's territorial claims, the indigenous Africans, were largely excluded from citizenship, land ownership, and political power for over a century. The Americo-Liberian elite, the men and women who had endured so much persecution, now created a class system based on their own Americanness, treating the indigenous people with a condescension and exclusionary attitude that was eerily similar to the white aristocracy they had escaped. They had replaced the racial hierarchy of America with a cultural hierarchy in Africa. Liberty, it seemed, was only for the former Americans.
By the 1840s, the ACS was running out of steam. They had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the colony, but it remained a struggle, a tiny, fragile pinprick on a vast continent. More critically, the various European colonial powers, Britain and France, were beginning to exert pressure. They challenged the colony's right to collect customs duties, arguing that a private American society could not claim sovereign control over a territory. The ACS realized they could no longer financially or politically protect their distant, unruly offspring. They decided to cut the cord. In a move that was less a celebration of independence and more a panicked abdication of responsibility, the ACS pushed the colony to declare itself a sovereign, independent republic. Independence and the Orphan Republic. On July 26, 1847, Liberia declared its independence. Its flag, a single star on a field of red and white stripes, was an unmistakable homage to the United States. Its first president was a highly educated, free-born black American from Virginia, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, a man who had left the racism of the South to become the leader of an entire nation. But the final, most mind-boggling detail of this story is the act of ultimate betrayal by its mother country. The United States, the country that had sponsored its creation, refused to recognize Liberia's independence for 15 long years. Why? Because the southern states, still dominated by the slaveocracy, were terrified. Recognizing a free, independent black republic would be an acknowledgement of black political capability and self-governance, a dangerous, combustible idea that might encourage their own slaves to revolt. They simply could not allow the U.S. government to officially legitimize a black-led nation. Liberia was left to twist in the wind, an American experiment built by Americans on land stolen with an American gun, but deliberately abandoned and unrecognized by its own mother country until the start of the Civil War in 1862. It became the Orphan Republic, born of an American contradiction, left alone to face the overwhelming challenges of the African continent and the predatory nature of European imperialism. Between 1820 and the outbreak of the American Civil War, the Ghost Fleet transported about 13,000 people from America to Liberia. They were a mix of free black citizens and emancipated slaves, the largest transoceanic migration of black people from the Americas back to Africa in history. A long and troubled shadow. The story of Liberia doesn't end in 1862, however. It lives on as a tragic warning about the lasting effects of prejudice and fear. For over a century, the descendants of the Americo-Liberians ruled the nation with an iron hand, maintaining their cultural and political dominance over the vast indigenous majority, often replicating the same injustices their ancestors had fled. The original paradox, freedom built on theft and exclusion, festered for generations. The tensions between the Americo-Liberian elite and the indigenous peoples finally exploded in the late 20th century in a series of brutal and devastating civil wars. The uncomfortable truth. So what is the ultimate moral of this wildest American experiment? The ACS, run by our nation's most famous figures, tried to solve the greatest moral problem in our history, slavery and racism, not through justice, but through expulsion. They believed that America could not and should not be a truly integrated society. The legacy of Liberia is a reminder that American history is not just a tale of noble ideals, but a tale of profound moral cowardice and geopolitical audacity. It proves that even when pursuing freedom, fear and self-interest can turn victims into new oppressors. It's the secret history we don't teach enough, the one that asks us if the most powerful men in the early republic saw no future for black equality in America, what does that say about the foundations we stood on? The Orphan Republic, born of an American paradox, remains a distant, uncomfortable echo of the price America was willing to pay to avoid facing itself. And that, folks, is the complete, astonishing, and truly shocking story of Liberia.
Thanks so much for sticking with me through this incredible piece of history. If you found this story as fascinating and thought-provoking as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of our past. See you in the next one.